identify both with their ethnic group and with the larger national group. Survey research also shows consistently that large majorities of all ethnic minority groups express an attachment with Britain. In particular, the attachment of the various Muslim minority groups is at least as high as that of other ethnic minority groups to Britain. So the evidence from the 2007 citizenship surveys shows that clearly there's really no difference between certainly the Pakistani and Bangladeshi group and whites in their attachment to Britain as a whole. In general, the pattern here is that there's very few differences across these ethnic categories. Now, there's a somewhat counterintuitive finding here, right? That Britons of Caribbean origin, the most integrated of the ethnic minority groups by most measures, seem to display at least a slightly lower level of attachment to Britain than do these other ethnic groups. This is a pattern that is consistent with the findings of previous surveys as well. So to better understand this pattern, this apparent paradox, we can turn to some survey questions regarding two related beliefs, attitudes toward immigration and perceptions of racial discrimination. So the 1997 British election study asked respondents whether it's better for immigrants to keep their customs and traditions or to adapt and blend into society. As you can see here, Black Caribbeans are strongly supportive of the more assimilationist approach. They're almost as supportive of the assimilationist approach as are whites, right? Pakistanis and especially Bangladeshis, the most recently arrived of these groups, stand out as the as displaying the greatest preference for maintaining their cultural distinctiveness. At the same time, though, Black Caribbeans are not more likely to see themselves as equal citizens, as being included as equal citizens as members of other ethnic minority groups. To the contrary, Black Caribbeans are more likely to perceive racial discrimination than are members of other minority groups in Britain, right? So again, looking at data from the 97 election study, you see that Blacks, Caribbeans in particular, are much more likely to see racism as a major problem facing Blacks and South Asians than are the various South Asian groups. Caribbeans also generally tend to display less trust in British political and social institutions than do South Asians. And Rasan Maxwell, in a recent paper, finds that these expectations of racial discrimination have a strong negative effect on ethnic minorities' sense of belonging to Britain. So, how then can we explain this apparent paradox between social integration and feelings of discrimination? Maxwell's argument is that the greater cultural and social assimilation of Caribbeans led them to have greater expectations about their incorporation, both politically and economically. So, consequently, when faced with difficulties on both these counts, Caribbeans developed more pessimistic attitudes than did South Asians, who had lower expectations about their incorporation prospects from the beginning. Another possible interpretation of this paradox, though, is that perhaps Blacks and South Asians perceive discrimination as occurring along different grounds. In particular, British-born Muslims may perceive themselves as victims of religious discrimination rather than victims of racial discrimination per se. A third possible interpretation would be that the greater integration of Caribbeans leads them to interact more frequently with whites, which exposes them to more opportunities to be discriminated against than are members of other groups. So to investigate this possibility, what we really need to do is to consider the effects of the spatial concentration or integration of minority groups on these groups' attitudes. Unfortunately, systematic evidence on the effects of ethnic concentration on minorities' attitudes is relatively scarce. Sager's model of the 1997 general election study does indicate that ethnic minorities were more likely to vote for Labour Party candidates if they lived in an area with a large ethnic minority population, even after controlling for individual level factors. So that finding is consistent with an expectation that the spatial concentration of ethnic minorities will lead to greater political homogeneity. However, contradictory findings are indicated by Bison's analysis of the Fourth National Survey of Ethnic Minorities. They look at questions relating to the importance of religion, attitudes towards interethnic marriage, and preferences regarding the racial composition of schools. And they find that the relative size of minority group members' own ethnic group in their neighborhood is associated with weaker religious or ethnic identities. They also find that this effect appears to be stronger for Muslims than for non-Muslim minority group members. Their interpretation of this effect is that minority group identification is intensified in situations where the groups are exposed to more interactions with the majority group. Now, this finding runs counter to the assumptions underlying much recent policymaking, and it also runs counter to the findings of a lot of qualitative research, which has tended to stress the importance of spatial integration as the key to reducing conflict between groups. So this in turn brings us to the question of how the spatial distribution of ethnic minority groups affects majority group members' identities and intergroup attitudes. In particular, does the experience of living amidst ethnic diversity increase understanding and tolerance of whites towards ethnic minorities, or does perceived competition over politics, jobs, housing, etc., result in greater conflict between groups? Research into these questions in Britain has largely drawn on two theories developed primarily in the American context: the contact hypothesis and racial threat theory. Right? Proponents of the contact hypothesis argue that interactions between in-group members and out-group members will cause prejudice towards the out-group to decline, at least under certain conditions. Conversely, racial threat theory argues that a white person who lives in an area with a large minority population is more likely to feel a conflict of interest with members of minority groups over limited resources, again, things such as housing, jobs, or political power.